The Hunger Plan. In May 1941, weeks before Germany invaded the Soviet Union, senior officials met in Berlin to solve a problem. The army was about to send millions of soldiers east, and there was no way to feed them from home. Supply lines would be too long, and Germany was already running low on food. A man named Herbert Backe, who ran food policy for the Reich, had a solution. He knew that most of the Soviet Union's food came from its southern farmland. His plan was to take all of it and ship it west to feed German troops and German civilians. The 30 million people living in the Soviet North would starve to death, and their land would be opened for German settlement. On May 2nd, General Georg Thomas chaired the meeting that approved the plan, and 3 weeks later, the orders were sent out to every occupation unit in the East, spelling out how food would be seized and who would get what was left. Rations were divided by race. Germans got full rations. Poles got 70%. Greeks got 30%. Jews got 20%. In the ghettos of Minsk and other occupied cities, that meant Jewish residents received around 420 calories a day. When the invasion began on June 22nd, Wehrmacht units moved through the east, taking food everywhere they went. Over the course of the war, they seized millions of tons of grain, oil, and meat. Soviet prisoners of war were starved deliberately in camps. Of the 5.7 million Soviet soldiers captured between 1941 and 1945, 3.3 million died, most of them from hunger. 2 million were dead by February 1942 alone. In some camps, death rates hit 2% per day, and prisoners resorted to eating the dead. Entire cities were sealed off and denied food. Civilians were forbidden to leave. By 1944, an estimated 4.2 million Soviet civilians had starved to death under German occupation. The full target of 30 million was never reached, only because Germany did not have enough troops to cut off food everywhere at once. Backe was arrested after the war and held for trial at Nuremberg. On April 6, 1947, before proceedings began, Backe was found dead in his cell. Thomas died in Allied custody months earlier. No one was ever convicted for the hunger plan. Siege of Leningrad. On September 8, 1941, German forces captured the town of Shlisselburg on the shores of Lake Ladoga, cutting the last land route into the city of Leningrad, now St. Petersburg. 3 million people were now trapped inside. This was the hunger plan applied to a single city. Hitler had no intention of capturing Leningrad. He ordered that it would not be allowed to surrender and that its population would not be fed. Leningrad would starve, and it did. As winter set in, food ran out. By November 20th, bread rations had dropped to 250 grams a day for factory workers and 125 grams for everyone else, including children. That was about 300 calories. The bread was mixed with sawdust to make it go further. Temperatures dropped to minus 40 degrees. The water pipes froze. There was no electricity, no heating, and no way out. People burned furniture, then books, then boiled wallpaper paste for food. In January and February 1942, roughly 100,000 people were dying every month. The only lifeline was Lake Ladoga. When the lake froze, Soviet truck convoys began crossing the ice in what became known as the Road of Life. The route ran 19 miles across open ice, within range of German guns. Drivers kept their doors open so they could jump if the ice broke. 1 in 4 trucks never made it back. But over the course of the siege, the Road of Life brought in over 1.6 million tons of supplies and evacuated more than 1.3 million people. The Soviet secret police arrested over 2,000 people for cannibalism. Meat made from human flesh appeared for sale at markets as people were murdered for their ration cards. A girl named Tanya Savicheva, 11 years old when the siege began, kept a short diary recording her family dying one by one. Her sister, her grandmother, her brother, 2 uncles, then her mother. The last entry read, "The Savichevs are dead. Everyone is dead. Only Tanya is left." She was evacuated to an orphanage but never recovered. She died in 1944. She was 14. On August 9, 1942, Dmitri Shostakovich's 7th Symphony premiered in Leningrad and was broadcast on loudspeakers toward the German lines. It was the date Hitler had chosen for a victory banquet at the city's Astoria Hotel. In January 1943, Soviet forces broke through south of Shlisselburg and opened a narrow land corridor into the city. A year later, on January 27, 1944, a full offensive drove the Germans back and the siege was over. It had lasted 872 days. Estimates of how many civilians died range from 800,000 to over 1.5 million. Field Marshal Wilhelm von Lieb, who commanded Army Group North, was sentenced to 3 years, most of it already served. His successor Georg von Küchler got 20 years and was released after 8. Jasenovac. In April 1941, Germany invaded Yugoslavia and broke it into pieces. One of those pieces was Croatia, which was handed to a fascist group called the Ustasha. The Ustasha wanted the country to be purely Croat, which meant Serbs, Jews, and Roma had to go. In August 1941, they built a camp on marshland about 62 miles southeast of Zagreb. They called it Jasenovac. There were no gas chambers. The guards killed with knives, hammers, axes, and their hands. One of the weapons was a curved blade strapped to a leather glove, designed for cutting throats quickly. The guards called it the Serb cutter. On the night of August 29, 1942, guards held a competition to see who could kill the most prisoners. A Franciscan friar named Petar Brzica claimed to have cut 1,360 throats. Another guard admitted to around 1,100. Prisoners were also burned alive in the camp's brick ovens and drowned in the Sava River. The man in charge of all Croatian camps was Vjekoslav Luburić. He personally killed inmates during his visits and once boasted that Jasenovac had slaughtered more people than the Ottoman Empire managed in all its years in Europe. One of the camp commanders was another Franciscan friar, Miroslav Filipović, known to prisoners as Brother Satan. Survivors described him throwing children into the air and catching them on a dagger. The Jasenovac Memorial has recorded 83,145 victims by name, including over 20,000 children. Historians estimate around 100,000 dead. The majority were Serbs, followed by Roma and Jews. On April 22, 1945, with the Yugoslav army closing in, the Ustasha began destroying the camp and killing the remaining prisoners. About 600 inmates tried to break out, armed with bricks and wooden planks. A man named Mile Ristic grabbed a machine gun from a guard. Another named Edo Sager climbed a telephone pole and cut the communication lines. 92 made it out. The rest were killed. Filipović was executed in Zagreb in 1946, still wearing his Franciscan robes. Luburić escaped to Spain and was killed by Yugoslav intelligence in 1969. Another commander, Dinko Sakic, fled to Argentina. In a 1998 television interview, he said he slept like a baby and would do it all again. He was sent back to Croatia, convicted, and died in prison in 2008. Action T4. In the summer of 1939, a couple in the German town of Pomsen wrote to Adolf Hitler asking him to let their baby die. The boy, Gerhard Kretschmar, had been born blind, missing limbs, and suffering from seizures. Hitler sent his personal doctor, Karl Brandt, to the hospital. On July 25th, the baby was killed with a lethal injection. He was 5 months old. In October 1939, Hitler signed an order giving Brandt and a senior official named Philip Bauer the power to grant what the regime called mercy death to patients judged incurable. The order was backdated to September 1st, the day Germany invaded Poland, so it would look like a wartime measure. The program was run from an office at Tiergartenstrasse 4 in Berlin, which gave it its name, Action T4. Doctors and midwives across Germany were required to report disabled newborns. 3 doctors reviewed each case on paper without ever seeing the patient. 2 marks out of 3 meant death. Children were killed first, by overdose or starvation, in special hospital wards. Over 5,000 were murdered this way. For adults, the regime built 6 killing centers disguised as care homes. Patients were transported in gray buses run by a fake ambulance company. When they arrived, they were led into rooms fitted with fake shower heads. Carbon monoxide was pumped in through the pipes. These were the first gas chambers the Nazis ever built. For every person killed, a fake death certificate was sent to the family along with an urn of random ashes. A Catholic bishop named Clemens von Galen gave a sermon on August 3, 1941, calling the killings murder. Thousands of copies spread across Germany. 3 weeks later, Hitler ordered the program stopped, but the killing never actually stopped. It moved to hospitals, where staff killed patients with drugs and starvation for the rest of the war. The last victim was a child named Richard Jenna, killed on May 29, 1945, 3 weeks after American troops had occupied his town. Between 200,000 and 300,000 people were killed, and the people who ran the gas chambers did not disappear. At least 92 of them were transferred to the death camps at Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka, where they used what they had learned to murder 1.7 million Jews. The firsts in command of all 3 camps came from Action T4. Brandt was executed in 1948. Wowen Massacre. In the early hours of July 11, 1943, units of the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, known as the UPA, attacked at least 99 Polish settlements across the Volhynia region of what is now western Ukraine. The attacks were timed for Sunday morning, when most people would be in church. Volhynia had a mixed population of Ukrainians, Poles, and Jews, and the tensions between them went back decades. Under Polish rule between the wars, Ukrainians had been pushed to the margins. Ukrainian schools dropped from over 400 to fewer than 10. Churches were seized. Land was given to Polish settlers. When Germany invaded and the old order collapsed, Ukrainian nationalists saw a chance to build a state of their own, and the Polish population was in the way. In June 1943, a UPA commander named Dmytro Klyachkivsky gave the order for what he called the complete physical liquidation of the Polish population. Roman Shukhevych, who took over as overall UPA commander later that year, extended the campaign into eastern Galicia. The weapons used were axes, pitchforks, scythes, and saws. Historians believe this was deliberate, meant to make planned killings look like a spontaneous peasant uprising. On July 11th, around 8,000 Poles were killed in a single day. Over the rest of the month, hundreds of villages were attacked and around 11,000 more were killed. The attacks continued into 1944. At Ostroki on August 30th, around 500 people were killed, nearly half of them children. At nearby Wola Ostrowiecka the same day, children were gathered in a school that was set on fire and hit with grenades. Over 500 people died there. Poles retaliated, killing an estimated 15,000 Ukrainians. The total number of Polish dead is still disputed. Polish historians put it as high as 100,000. Ukrainian historians say around 40,000. Most Western scholars estimate somewhere between 50,000 and 100,000. In 2016, the Polish parliament voted 432-0 to classify the massacres as genocide. Ukraine rejected the term. No international body has recognized it as such. Poland has been one of Ukraine's strongest allies since Russia's invasion in 2022, and the massacre remains unresolved between them. In January 2025, the two governments reached an agreement to allow families to begin exhuming the dead. Sandakan death marches. In July 1942, the Japanese army built a prisoner of war camp at Sandakan in British North Borneo, now part of Malaysia. About 2,434 prisoners were held there, mostly Australian and British, put to work building a military airfield. The camp commander, Captain Hoshijima Susumi, told the men when they arrived that they would work until their bones rotted under the tropical sun of Borneo. By early 1945, the airfield had been destroyed by Allied bombing and Allied forces were closing in. Rather than let the prisoners be liberated, the Japanese decided to march them 162 miles through the jungle to a town called Ranao and burn the camp behind them. The men were starving, sick with malaria and dysentery, and most had no shoes. They were given 4 days of food for a journey that took over 2 weeks. The first march left on January 28, 1945, with about 455 men. Anyone who fell behind was shot or bayoneted. By June, 6 were still alive. The second march left on May 29th with about 536 men. Only 183 reached Ranao. The third march left on June 9th with about 75 men. They were so weak that none made it past 31 miles. Every one of them was shot where they fell. The prisoners left behind at Sandakan, roughly 250 men too sick to walk, were killed in the camp. The last prisoner was beheaded on August 15, 1945, the day Japan surrendered. Out of 2,434 prisoners, 6 survived. All 6 were Australian, and all survived because they escaped. One of them, Owen Campbell, got away during the second march after his companion, a man named Edward Skinner, cut his own throat with a tin can because he was too sick to keep going and did not want to slow Campbell down. Another, Richard Braithwaite, was rescued on his 28th birthday by an American patrol boat. When told a rescue was being planned for the remaining prisoners, he turned to the wall and cried. He said they would be too late. Captain Hoshijima and several other officers were executed at the Labuan war crimes trials in 1946. The story was kept quiet for decades. Wola Massacre. On August 1, 1944, the Polish Home Army launched an uprising against the German occupation of Warsaw. That night, Hitler gave Himmler an order. Every inhabitant was to be killed, no prisoners taken, and the city razed to the ground. Himmler passed the order down the chain, and on August 5th, German forces entered the Wola district to carry it out. The troops were led by Heinz Rheinefarth, an SS general, and included the Dirlewanger Brigade, a unit made up of convicted criminals recruited from prisons and concentration camps. They moved down Wolska Street house by house, pulling civilians from basements, separating men from women, and marching them to execution sites. At the Ursus factory, around 7,000 people were machine-gunned in the courtyard. Thousands more were killed at the Franisek factory and the railway embankment on Gorchevska Street. The killing squads went through ammunition so fast that armored vehicles had to bring replacement machine gun barrels. Then, they went into hospitals. At Wolski Hospital, soldiers shot the doctors, the chaplain, and then executed around 400 patients and staff. At St. Lazarus Hospital, hundreds of patients were killed, and the building burned. A woman named Wanda Lurie, 33 years old and 9 months pregnant, lost her 3 children at the Ursus factory. She was struck in the head by a bullet and left for dead, lying among the bodies for 3 days before she was eventually found alive. On August 5th alone, roughly 20,000 people were killed. The massacre continued for a week. By August 12th, when the order to stop killing civilians was given, an estimated 50,000 people were dead. Dirlewanger was beaten to death by Polish guards in a prison camp in June 1945. Erich von dem Bach-Zelewski, the overall commander, testified at Nuremberg in exchange for protection and was eventually sentenced to life in prison for a murder committed in 1933, not for anything that happened in Warsaw. Rheinefarth was never charged. After the war, he was elected mayor of a town on the German island of Sylt, served in the state parliament, collected a general's pension, and died at home in 1979. Suk Ching Massacre. On February 15, 1942, the British surrendered Singapore to the Japanese. 3 days later, the killing began. The Japanese had planned it before the city fell. On December 28, 1941, weeks before the surrender, the 25th Army had already drawn up guidelines for dealing with the Chinese population. Lieutenant General Tomoyuki Yamashita gave the orders. Colonel Tsuji Masanobu, his chief of planning, ran the operation. Chinese men between 18 and 50 were told to report to screening centers across the city. When they arrived, hooded informants pointed out anyone they considered suspicious: communists, former British volunteers, intellectuals, teachers, men with tattoos, recent immigrants from China. At some centers, there was no screening at all. Men were sent down one of 2 paths when they arrived, and one path led to execution. The choice was random. Those who passed received a square stamp on their arm marked examined. Those who failed were loaded onto trucks and driven to beaches across the island. At Changi Beach, Punggol Beach, and Tanah Merah, they were tied together in rows, marched into the sea, and machine-gunned from behind. The operation spread to Malaya, where the killings were even less selective. At Kota Tinggi, about 2,000. At Ju Lung Lung, nearly 1,500. The death toll has never been agreed on. Japan says around 5,000. Singapore says around 40,000, and that is only counting Singapore itself. Lee Kuan Yew, who later became the country's first prime minister, put the number at 50,000 in Singapore and 70,000 including Malaya. Lee himself nearly became a victim. He was about to be screened when a trishaw rider pulled him away and hit him. 7 Japanese officers were tried in Singapore in 1947. Yamashita had already been executed the year before for atrocities in the Philippines, not for Suk Ching. 2 officers were executed. 5 received life sentences and served about 5 years. Tsuji, the man who designed the operation, was never tried. He escaped to China, came back to Japan, got elected to parliament, and disappeared in Laos in 1961. In 1966, Japan paid Singapore $50 million. The agreement avoided the words damages and reparations. No apology was ever given. If you'd like to see more stories like this, make sure to subscribe and feel free to drop suggestions for the next video in the comments.